Bleak Ridge Psychiatric Hospital, abandoned in the late 1980s following a wave of inexplicable suicides among the staff, greeted the expedition of researchers with the classic stench of rot and stagnant moisture. The walls, once covered in light green paint, were now peeling like the skin of a reptile, exposing raw gray concrete. Most of the medical archives had been destroyed by water and time, melting into solid lumps of decayed paper. However, in the basement level, which once housed the wing for especially dangerous and incurable patients, the researchers discovered a hermetic metal safe bearing military markings. Inside lay only a single folder, a thick, khaki-colored cardboard file with only a number written in faded ink. Patient 714, no name, no date of birth, no photograph. Just a thick stack of daily observation logs kept continuously for 40 years, from 1944 to 1984. The facility's chief physician, Dr. Arthur van der Meer, had personally filled out every single page. From the very first sheets, it becomes clear that medical science had collided with something that defied the laws of biology. Patient 714 had been admitted to the clinic at the age of 25 after being found in the middle of a forest in a state of absolute catatonic stupor. His eyes were wide open, and his pupils did not react to light. But the most terrifying detail was discovered later, during the first week of monitoring. The man did not sleep at all. Modern medicine dictates that a human being dies without sleep by the 10th day. The brain begins to break down under the weight of its own toxins, hallucinations manifest, and internal organs fail. Yet, patient 714 disproved these laws every single day. His blood work remained perfect, his muscle tone never deteriorated, and the glucose levels in his brain matched those of a healthy person working tirelessly. At the end of the first year of observation, Dr. van der Meer wrote, "We connected electrodes to his skull during what was supposed to be his nightly rest. The machine displayed a continuous, aggressive burst of beta waves. His brain was working at peak capacity, as if he were running a marathon or solving complex mathematical equations in his mind. Yet, the patient merely sat on the edge of his bed in the corner of the cell, staring at a single spot on the wall. When I attempted to close his eyelids with my fingers, his body began to convulse violently, and his heart rate spiked to 200 beats per minute. He resisted sleep as if sleep were a death sentence. Decades rolled by. The world outside the hospital walls was changing. The war ended, humans flew into space, new generations grew up. But inside cell number 4 of the basement floor, time seemed to stand still. Patient 714 did not age. No gray appeared in his hair, his skin remained smooth, and his gaze was unbelievably sharp and clear. He never spoke to the staff, ignored food unless it was forced down his throat via a tube, and never, not once in 40 years, closed his eyes. The hospital caretakers grew dreadfully afraid of night shifts in his wing. They claimed that when the corridor lights were put out, patient 714's eyes would faintly glow in the dark with a phosphorescent green sheen, and the air around his cell would turn heavy and freezing, like the inside of a meat locker. The final pages of the journal are dated November 1984. Dr. van der Meer's handwriting had become illegible and distorted, the letters collapsing into one another, betraying the author's profound psychological collapse. The last entry was made just hours before the doctor was found dead in his office, his carotid arteries torn open. Dried blood covered his fingers, with which he had tried to scrawl something onto his desk. The journal contained these final words: "Today, I did what I had feared doing for 40 years. I injected him with a maximum dose of neuroleptics, mixed with a massive dose of barbiturates. I wanted to give him peace. I wanted him to finally sleep." As his muscles went limp and his eyelids, heavy with chemicals, began to slowly descend, he looked directly into my eyes for the very first time and spoke. His voice was not human, it was the simultaneous resonance of thousands of different voices. Male, child, female, speaking in various tongues of the world. He said, "You fool. You have destroyed the shield. I do not stay awake because I cannot. I stay awake because if I close my eyes for even a single second, my brain will lose control and begin broadcasting foreign memories. The memories of those who haven't been born yet, and those who died billions of years ago in agony. My mind is an antenna that keeps the gates shut. If I fall asleep, they will all wake up inside your head. Now I sit in my office, and the patient's eyelids in ward number 4 are closed, and I can already hear them. I hear the children of ancient Babylon weeping in my head. I hear the screams of people burning in the nuclear fires of the future, and I see the geometry of stars consuming galaxies. My brain cannot endure this. I must stop it the only way available to me. If you find this journal, never, do you hear me, never let him close his eyes again.
The Third Hand. 28-year-old architect Mark Kaminsky lost his left arm during a horrific car crash on a desolate highway. The twisted metal of the vehicle had crushed his bones and nerve endings so severely that an amputation above the elbow was the only way to save him from fatal gangrene. For a creative individual whose entire livelihood depended on sketches, blueprints, and drawings, this was a definitive life sentence. However, 3 months later, Mark caught an unbelievable stroke of luck. He received a call from a private transplant clinic informing him that a donor had become available, a young man who had died that very morning, matching him perfectly in biological parameters and blood type. The surgical procedure lasted 14 hours. The nation's leading surgeons painstakingly stitched together vessels, tendons, and microscopic nerve fibers, thread by thread. When Mark awoke from the anesthesia, he felt an overwhelming wave of relief. In place of the empty void hung a new, living arm. It was slightly paler than his own skin, and on the wrist, a faint scar marked the place where the deceased donor had tried to laser off a tattoo prior to his death. At first, everything progressed flawlessly. The rehabilitation process was moving far ahead of schedule. Within 3 weeks, Mark could flex his fingers into a fist, feel the warmth of a hot mug, and even hold a pencil. The medical staff labeled it a miracle. However, Mark himself began to notice the first anomalies. Sometimes, when he was deep in thought, his left hand would begin to make involuntary, twitching micro-movements, as if it were trying to feel something invisible in the air. The moment he looked directly at it, the movements would cease instantly. The true nightmare commenced at the end of the first month. Mark began waking up in the mornings with a sensation of immense fatigue in his left arm, as though he had spent the entire night performing hard manual labor. Initially, he dismissed it as phantom spasms and the nervous system adapting to the graft. But one night, waking up abruptly at 3 a.m, he realized that the left side of his body was completely numb and the arm itself was moving entirely independent of his will. He could not control it. The arm slowly slid out from under the blanket, fumbled around the nightstand until it found a sketchbook and a pen that Mark kept for rough designs, and began writing rapidly and confidently in pitch darkness. Mark lay there frozen, paralyzed by a raw, primal terror. He watched his own fingers trace numbers onto the paper with unbelievable speed. The pressure was so intense that the pencil lead snapped several times, yet the hand didn't stop, gouging into the paper with the metal tip of the holder. When the process finished, the arm went completely limp and collapsed onto the mattress like an appliance unplugged from the wall. As soon as Mark regained control over his muscles, he flicked on the light and stared at the sketchbook in horror. The page was filled with dozens of lines of geographic coordinates. Degrees, minutes, seconds. All of them pointed to the exact same grid location deep within a dense suburban forest, a place devoid of roads or human settlements. The following night, the event repeated, but the hand wasn't just writing coordinates anymore. It began to draw. It sketched detailed, grotesque portraits of human face with wide-set, staring eyes and a mouth sewn shut with thick thread. Mark tried binding his left arm to the bedpost with heavy leather straps before falling asleep, but at 2 a.m, he awoke from excruciating pain. The arm was fighting for freedom with such savage strength that the straps cut into his flesh to the bone, and his finger joints twisted at unnatural angles. The hand craved paper. It wanted to tell a story. The lingering dread escalated into an open war for survival on the 30th day post-surgery. Mark sat at his desk, trying to concentrate on a new architectural project. Suddenly, his right hand accidentally knocked a ruler off the desk. As he bent down to retrieve it, the left arm acted with lightning speed. It whipped upward, coiled tightly around Mark's neck from behind, and began squeezing his throat with the force of a hydraulic press. Mark gasped, desperately trying to tear the fingers of his left hand away from his throat using his right hand. But the donor limb proved to be exponentially stronger. The muscles within it flexed so violently that the scars on the wrist began to tear open, weeping dark blood. Mark caught his reflection in the dark monitor of his computer. His own grafted arm was actively trying to murder him, while the fingers of his right hand snapped and fractured as he tried to break the lethal chokehold. He began to lose consciousness. The world before his eyes started to dim, blurring into crimson patches. With a final, desperate surge of willpower, Mark grabbed a pair of heavy metal shears from the desk and drove them with all his might into the shoulder of the left arm. Only then did the nerve impulses short-circuit, and the iron grip around his throat collapsed. Mark survived, but now he sits locked inside a bare room, his left arm chained securely to a cast-iron radiator by a heavy automotive chain. He cannot sleep, because the moment his eyes close, the hand begins to scratch against the metal of the radiator, softly and rhythmically tapping out a message in Morse code. When Mark finally translated the tapping, it revealed just a single word, repeating for eternity. Dig. Dig me up. Dig us up.
Mirror organs. For Professor Oleg Vershinin, a surgeon with 30 years of experience, this was supposed to be a routine appendectomy. The patient was an ordinary 20-year-old student named Artur Novak, rushed in by an ambulance with acute abdominal pain. However, as soon as the scalpel made the first deep incision and the retractors pulled back the edges of the wound, the entire surgical team froze in absolute speechlessness. Where the appendix should have been, there was nothing but an empty void. Vershinin adjusted the angle of the overhead shadowless lamp. What he saw defied every anatomy textbook ever written. All of the patient's internal organs were arranged in a perfect mirror order. The heart was beating on the right side, the liver was located on the left, and the stomach was inverted in the opposite direction. Medicine knows this phenomenon. It is called situs inversus, and it is extremely rare. The doctor breathed a sigh of relief, preparing to resume his work, but his gaze suddenly locked onto the surface of the spleen. It was not smooth. Upon the pink biological tissue of the organ, something dark and sharply defined stood out. The professor grabbed a surgical magnifying glass and leaned in closer. It was not blood vessels, nor was it a tumor. It was a brand, perfectly straight. Microscopic letters and numbers were burned directly into the living organ, looking exactly like a laser engraving on a factory assembly line. Vershinin began to carefully lift the other organs, cold sweat drenching his forehead beneath his sterile cap. On the lower lobe of the mirrored liver, a label was clearly engraved, Series B, 098821X. The wall of the stomach featured a fine, detailed barcode. And on the heart itself, directly upon the convulsively contracting myocardium, a stamp was driven that caused the anesthesiologist to drop his syringe. Model 2026. Expiration date passed. "This is not a human body," the assistant whispered, backing away from the table. "What is this? What have we stumbled into?" The professor ordered everyone to remain silent under penalty of losing their licenses and concluded the operation, suturing the patient. The next day, Artur Novak regained consciousness. He felt excellent, smiled, and suspected absolutely nothing. Driven by suspicion, Vershinin conducted a covert investigation, pulling the medical records of every patient with situs inversus in the city over the past 5 years. The results were terrifying. They had all been born in the exact same month, and they all possessed flawless anthropometric data as if designed to a singular blueprint. When the doctor attempted to perform a follow-up MRI on Artur, the machine abruptly short-circuited and fried, flashing a single text line across the monitor. Unauthorized scanning of bioproduct is prohibited by the copyright holder. The nightmare concluded a week later. Artur Novak simply vanished from his ward in the dead of night. Surveillance cameras captured a black, unmarked van pulling up to the hospital at 3 a.m. 2 individuals dressed in sealed gray jumpsuits, looking more like factory technicians than medics or kidnappers, stepped out. They entered the ward and emerged 5 minutes later, escorting Artur by his arms. The boy walked with absolute compliance, his eyes glassy, his movements entirely synchronous and mechanical. On the bed in the empty ward, Vershinin found an official document printed on a thick sheet of gray plastic. It bore no signatures or stamps, just a single typed line. "Thank you for identifying a defect in batch 2026. bioproduct Artur Novak has been decommissioned due to the expiration of its operational lifespan. We remind medical staff, disassembling and researching models without a developer's license results in the immediate termination of your current simulation.
Phantom Twin. 30-year-old Igor Boyko spent his entire life living with a dull, nagging pain in his right flank, just beneath his ribs. Since his childhood, doctors had repeated the exact same diagnosis. It was a phantom pain, a localized neuralgia, or the psychological echo of a minor childhood injury he had long forgotten. His lab results were consistently optimal. An ultrasound displayed nothing but a minor tissue thickening, dismissed as a routine lipoma or a benign fatty tumor. Igor grew accustomed to drowning the ache in handfuls of painkillers, trying his best to ignore the bizarre sensation that manifested every single time he drifted off to sleep. It felt as though something within his abdomen was turning over, very slowly, like a tiny, living ball of flesh, trying to find a more comfortable posture to sleep in. In May 2026, the nature of the pain changed abruptly. It ceased to be dull. Instead, it transformed into sharp, acute, spasmodic jolts accompanied by a distinct sound resonating from deep within his own flesh. It was the sound of scraping bones or frantic scratching. Whenever Igor pressed his palm against his flank, he could feel something hard and pointed pushing outward against his skin, as if attempting to puncture through his abdominal wall. Driven by sheer panic, he sought out a private clinic to undergo a comprehensive computed tomography (CT) scan. The moment the radiologist projected the three-dimensional reconstruction of the scan onto the large monitor, his face turned completely pale, and he abruptly requested Igor to wait out in the corridor. But Igor had already managed to steal a glance at the screen. What he witnessed shattered his sanity in an instant. Nestled deep within his abdominal cavity, tightly ensnared by his own web of blood vessels, resided a fetus in fetu, the medical anomaly known as a parasitic twin. It was his undeveloped brother, whom Igor had accidentally absorbed while still inside his mother's womb. Typically, such fetuses calcify and remain lifeless for the host's entire existence. But this twin was not dead. For some inexplicable reason, its biological clock had restarted. The CT scan clearly illustrated a fully formed spine, underdeveloped miniature arms ending in sharp fingernails, and a functional jaw lined with adult, razor-sharp teeth. Most terrifyingly, the twin had shifted its posture compared to older childhood X-rays. It had turned around. Its small, bony hands were now gripping Igor's internal organs, and its jaw was locked open in a spasmodic, biting motion. It wasn't merely growing. It was quite literally chewing its way out, sustaining itself on its brother's living tissue. "You require immediate emergency surgery," the surgeon stated, his voice trembling. "It will rupture the mesentery and trigger a fatal internal hemorrhage within a matter of days." The operation was scheduled for the following morning, but Igor never made it to the hospital bed. That very night, he awoke in his home from a pain so savage and paralyzing that he had never conceived its possibility. It felt as though a grenade had detonated within his midsection. Looking down, he saw that the white fabric of his t-shirt over his stomach was rapidly saturating with thick, scalding blood. The skin on his right side had stretched to its absolute limit and split open. Through the bloody rupture, a set of small, cyanotic human fingers with fine, incredibly sharp nails emerged first. They clawed frantically at the edges of Igor's torn flesh, widening the exit. And then, from deep within the cavity, a low, wet wheeze echoed. Igor collapsed to the floor, hemorrhaging severely and paralyzed by traumatic shock. The absolute last thing he witnessed before consciousness faded entirely was a miniature jaw, drenched in slime and blood, slowly forcing its way out of his body, snapping convulsively at the room's air, and a pair of tiny, solid black eyes staring back up at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. His twin had finally been born.
Foreign voice syndrome. 22-year-old linguistics student Anna Koval had never traveled outside her native province and held absolutely no interest in the history of the ancient world. Her life was entirely ordinary until she suffered a sudden ischemic stroke right in the middle of a university lecture. Doctors in the intensive care unit fought for her life for 2 days. When Anna finally opened her eyes, her speech center had undergone what appeared to be an irreversible transformation. She had completely forgotten her native tongue. She could no longer comprehend a word of Ukrainian or English. Instead, from her lips poured a continuous, flawlessly structured rhythmic speech delivered with a strange, guttural cadence. To investigate this anomalous case, the clinic invited a prominent professor of linguistics, Dr. Dmytro Kramer. The moment he stepped into the ward and heard the initial sounds the girl was producing, his notebook slipped from his fingers. Anna was speaking in the archaic Attic dialect of ancient Greek, the exact tongue spoken in Athens during the 5th century BCE. She utilized grammatical structures known only to a few dozen scholars worldwide, pronouncing words with an authentic phonetics that modern science had spent centuries trying to reconstruct. Medicine documents foreign accent syndrome, but the total mastery of a dead language following brain trauma was biologically impossible. Professor Kramer installed a reel-to-reel tape recorder in the ward, beginning around-the-clock recordings of everything the girl uttered to translate her words later. Anna sat upright on her bed, her gaze locked onto the upper corner of the room, her face remaining entirely motionless. Only her lips moved. She recited lengthy sentences that, in their acoustic rhythm, resembled ancient epics or invocations. When Kramer spent his first night translating the initial batches of recordings, his hair began to turn gray. Anna was not merely hallucinating. She was reading lists. He was transcribing word for word, Kramer's assistant later recalled. The structure of the text never altered. First came the individual's full name, followed by their age, the precise time down to the second, and the exact manner in which their soul would depart their body. But the most terrifying part was that all these names belonged to living people. In the first block of translation, Kramer recognized with horror the name of the clinic's chief physician. Across from his name, written in ancient Greek, was, "The heart will cease inside the iron cage at 1422. The following day, at exactly 1422, the chief physician passed away from an acute myocardial infarction, trapped inside the hospital elevator between floors. Further down the list were random pedestrians, patients from neighboring wards, and prominent politicians. Anna's prophecies materialized with absolute mathematical precision. Following the stroke, her brain seemed to have hardwired into the universal information field of death, and the ancient tongue was the only biological instrument capable of enduring that terrible vibration. Kramer became utterly obsessed. He stopped sleeping, his eyes turned bloodshot, and he locked himself within his study, translating miles of magnetic tape. He attempted to find a way to alter at least one impending death, but every effort to intervene only accelerated the tragedy, rendering it even more bizarre and violent. By the third week of the investigation, Anna fell completely silent. She simply sat on the floor beneath the window and closed her eyes. In a state of panic, Kramer rushed to the final untranslated cassette, recorded an hour prior to her silence. The girl's voice on the tape sounded fainter, breaking into a raspy whisper, as if her vocal cords were tearing from the strain. The professor activated slow playback and began deciphering the final line. His hand holding the pen trembled so violently it tore through the paper. At the very bottom of the list, there was only one name left. His own. The translation read, Dmytro Kramer, 62 years old. At 23:59. He will comprehend that the language I speak belongs not to the gods, but to the entity standing directly behind his back. He will turn around. Kramer glanced up at the wall clock. The hands indicated 23:58. In the absolute silence of his study, he distinctly heard someone behind him take a deep, freezing breath.
The deafness virus. It all began in the opening weeks of summer. A new strain of a respiratory virus, initially dismissed as a mild variant of the common cold, swept across the globe in mere days. Its primary clinical symptom was the instantaneous and complete loss of hearing exactly on the 5th day post-infection. No pain, no elevated temperature. Simply, in one localized moment, the individual felt as though they had been submerged deep underwater. Within a month, 1/3 of the planet's population found themselves trapped in an absolute vacuum. The cities fell silent. Drivers no longer sounded their horns. Television towers broadcasted nothing but subtitles, and an eerie, unnatural silence dominated the streets. 25-year-old sound engineer Maxim Levchenko attempted to shield himself until the very last, wearing heavy respirators, but the virus eventually breached his defenses as well. He awoke one morning in his apartment and failed to hear the blare of his alarm clock. He struck his palm against the wall. Pure silence. He activated his professional studio monitors at maximum output. The cones vibrated violently, displacing the air, but no sound materialized. Initially, humanity attempted to adapt. People began learning sign language and relying exclusively on text messengers. Governments issued assurances that the phenomenon was temporary and that scientists were actively developing a vaccine to regenerate the auditory nerve. However, the true horror did not reside in the fact that people could no longer hear the world. The true horror lay in what they began to hear instead. A week after the onset of total deafness, patients worldwide began mass reporting to psychiatrists who could still communicate via text. The descriptions of their conditions were mirror identical. They asserted that they had not gone deaf. The virus had not destroyed their eardrums. It had simply dissolved the natural biological filter of the human brain, the shield that protected consciousness from the actual acoustic background of the universe. The silence around them became so profoundly loud that it began to drown out all earthly manifestations. This is not the absence of sound. Maxim typed in his journal on his computer. It is the presence of something else. Initially, it was just white noise, resembling the static of an old television. But with each passing day, this static grows more distinct. It is billions of voices whispering directly beneath my skull. They're not speaking to me. They're simply cataloging data. They are counting the remaining seconds until Earth's atmosphere ignites. They whisper the precise coordinates of black holes advancing toward us. This sound does not originate from the ears. It resonates within the very bones of the skeleton. People lost the ability to sleep. The volume of this cosmic whisper escalated with every passing night. No earplugs or industrial noise-canceling headphones offered relief. For the allowed to resist.
Anesthesia. For 35-year-old engineer Denis Romanoff, a scheduled operation on his nasal septum was supposed to be a quick, routine medical procedure. He was laid on the table. The anesthesiologist smiled warmly, pressed a plastic mask to his face, and told him to count backward from 10 to 1. At the number 4, the light in his eyes vanished. But the darkness did not last long. After what felt like a few subjective minutes, Denis suddenly regained consciousness. The room was bright. He heard the metallic clinking of instruments and the voices of doctors. He tried to take a deep breath, but his lungs wouldn't obey. A machine was breathing for him. He tried to move a finger, to scream, to blink, but his body had transformed into a heavy, monolithic, reinforced concrete cocoon. Denis was facing the ultimate nightmare of surgical patients: anesthesia awareness. The chemical agents had completely paralyzed his muscles and vocal cords, but his consciousness and nerve endings had returned fully to life. When the scalpel touched his face, a wild, white-hot agony pierced his entire being. He screamed inside his own mind, begging for mercy, but the heart monitor somehow continued to display a steady, calm rhythm. They could not see his torment. The pain became his only reality, but soon Denis noticed that the operation was progressing entirely differently from what had been described to him. The surgeons weren't just correcting a septum. They were making long, deep incisions across his entire chest. They discussed his anatomy, but their language was bizarre. They used medical terms intermingled with engineering concepts: fuel lines, organic chassis, visual surveillance system. Denis strained every single ounce of his willpower to part his eyelids by even a millimeter. Through a narrow slit between his eyelashes, blurred by surgical ointment, he was finally able to glimpse the space above him. 3 figures in sterile blue gowns stood around the table. The shadowless overhead lamp brightly illuminated their faces. Suddenly, the surgeon holding a clamp stopped. "It's too hot in here," he said in a low, grating voice. "Take these off." The surgeons synchronized their movements, raising their hands to untie the strings of their medical masks. They dropped them to the floor. Beneath the white fabric, there were no human faces. There was nothing but smooth, featureless, pale gray skin with no eyes, no nostrils and no mouth. Only in the center of what should have been a face, a vertical membranous slit slowly pulsed, emitting a faint blue glow. Panic incinerated the remaining fragments of Denis's sanity. The faceless entities leaned lower over his torn body. They did not use eyes, yet their long, thin, four-jointed fingers moved inside his chest cavity with supernatural precision. One of them touched his heart, and Denis felt an icy chill flood his veins. The membrane on the face of the lead surgeon expanded, producing a sound like a rusty door creaking. "This specimen has awakened ahead of schedule again. The fear hormone levels are off the charts. The neural network interface has integrated poorly with the biological substrate. We must replace the central processing unit or fully overhaul the chassis." Another creature reached toward his head. Denis felt cold fingers penetrating beneath his skull behind his ears, groping for wires that grew directly out of his brain. He realized that the operating room was not a hospital, and his life up to this point had not been real. Around him was a factory floor. Before his consciousness was permanently snuffed out by a new, heavy chemical current, he heard the final clinking of metal and a quiet whisper: "Prepare the next model."
The X-ray. For 30-year-old dental surgeon Andriy Savchenko, the workday was coming to a close. His final patient was Mikhailo Petrenko, a 40-year-old accountant from a local transport depot, who complained of a strange, dull ache in his lower jaw near the molars. To the naked eye, it looked like a standard case of hidden pulpitis or a routine bone cyst. Andriy routinely seated the man in the chair, adjusted the heavy protective lead apron over his chest, aimed the digital radiograph tube at his right cheek, and stepped behind protective shield to press the trigger button. The machine emitted a short, sharp beep, and a second later, the black and white digital X-ray of the jaw materialized on the computer monitor. Andriy walked over to the screen, holding a cup of coffee, and nearly dropped it. The anatomy of the bone and roots was absolute perfection, save for one glaring anomaly. Inside the spongy bone tissue of the lower jaw, directly beneath the roots of the 7th and 8th molars, where by all laws of biology there should have been solid bone structure, lay a distinct void of perfectly circular shape. It resembled a tiny cave. But the most terrifying detail was what resided inside that empty void. Andriy zoomed in on the image using his mouse wheel, turning the contrast and sharpness to their maximum levels. The doctor's heart skipped a beat. On the X-ray film, right in the center of the dark void inside the living bone, stood a miniature but completely formed human eye. It was not a calcified bone growth. The scan clearly delineated soft tissues, a rounded eyeball, the delicate curvature of a lens, a retina, and even the microscopic muscle fibers that held it in place. But what caused the doctor to feel a paralyzing chill was the orientation of the pupil. The pupil of the subbone eye was turned upward at an unnatural angle, staring directly into the lens of the X-ray machine. It knew it was being photographed. Mikhailo, Andriy began cautiously, straining to keep his voice level as he turned back to the patient. Have you ever had surgery on your jaw? Any severe trauma? Car accidents? No, doctor, never, Petrenko replied, looking at the dentist with a puzzled expression. Why? Is it that bad? A cyst? Andriy did not dare show the scan to the patient. He lied, claiming the machine had glitched, and requested Mikhailo to remain perfectly still so he could take a second image from a different angle. The doctor stepped behind the shield once more. His fingers trembled as he pressed the button. The new image flashed onto the screen. The eye inside the jaw had shifted. It had now rotated 90 degrees and was staring to the bone directly at Andriy, as if watching him through the monitor. The lingering dread escalated into an absolute catastrophe when Andriy approached the chair to examine the patient's oral cavity with a dental mirror. The moment he asked Mikhailo to open his mouth and brought the instrument toward the lower teeth, Petrenko suddenly arched his back in the chair, seized by a violent convulsive spasm. His eyes rolled back, and a stream of thick, dark blood erupted from beneath the gum line of the 7th tooth. The bone tissue of the patient's jaw began to force itself apart, with a loud cracking sound. Andriy recoiled as he heard that wet, fracturing noise. The gum split completely in two, exposing the white underlying bone. But what emerged from that bloody tear was neither a new tooth nor a fragment of a fractured root. Through the ruptured tissues, a living, moist human eye without eyelids slowly forced its way outward. Its iris was a vibrant, striking blue, and the capillaries on the white sclera pulsed frantically upon contact with the room's air. It darted rapidly from side to side, scanning the sterile dental office, before finally locking its gaze onto the face of the doctor, who was paralyzed with horror. In that exact second, Mikhailo Petrenko stopped screaming. His features relaxed. He closed his mouth, clamping the foreign eye between his teeth, and offered Andriy a soft, completely peaceful smile.
The fear cure. Deep within the laboratories of the military medical conglomerate Pharmacorp, a breakthrough drug named Atraxin was synthesized. These were small, colorless tablets engineered to entirely shut down the sensations of fear, anxiety, and panic in human subjects by selectively blocking receptors within the amygdala, the brain's emotional command center. For the final phase of clinical trials, a cohort of 10 volunteers was assembled: combat veterans with severe PTSD, individuals with chronic phobias, and patients suffering from debilitating panic attacks. The study was conducted under around-the-clock surveillance inside a secure research facility located on the 10th floor of a modern skyscraper. For the first 4 days, the data pointed to an absolute triumph. Individuals who had been unable to step outside for years due to crippling agoraphobia were now smiling, socializing effortlessly, and displaying total emotional equilibrium. The project director, Dr. Leonid Brandt, noted in his laboratory log, the subjects described their mental state as absolute serenity. Their nightmares have completely vanished, and their heart rates remain perfectly level even during intense stress testing. The compound demonstrates 100% efficacy. We have engineered the world's first society entirely liberated from fear. However, on the 5th day, the behavior of the test subjects began to deviate. Their serenity curdled into something else altogether, a complete, absolute absence of the primal survival instinct, bordering on a bizarre religious obsession. They ceased responding to physical pain. They could hold their hands over scalding steam for hours, examining their blisters without a shred of emotion on their features, and spoke exclusively in hushed whispers. Dr. Brand observed that the patients had begun assembling together at night within the Grand Recreational Lounge, which featured massive panoramic windows overlooking the sprawling metropolis. They never illuminated the room. They simply stood pressed against the glass, staring intently down at the midnight streets and out into the void of the dark sky. When Brand attempted to conduct a clinical interview, one of the veterans, serving as the group's informal leader, turned to him with an absolutely pure, crystalline smile. "You believe that fear was merely a chemical error of the brain, Doctor. But you were wrong. Fear is the only fence that prevented us from witnessing the objective truth. It protected us. Now that you have dismantled it, we can finally see what resides out there in the dark. There is no empty void. Something is waiting out there, and it is calling us. It is beautiful beyond measure." Brand ordered security personnel to double the guard and lock down all exits, but it was already too late. The drug had completely rewritten the architecture of their cognition. For human beings devoid of fear, physical locks, institutional mandates, and concrete walls no longer possessed any functional meaning. On the night of June 11, 2026, the main electrical grid of the research wing abruptly failed. Security cameras operating on emergency backup power captured all 10 subjects rising from their beds simultaneously at 3 in the morning. They did not hurry. They moved with the fluid grace of individuals walking toward a long-awaited celebration. They entered the Grand Lounge. The guards who attempted to intercept them backed away in absolute terror. The subjects walked directly toward the drawn weapons, smiling and completely ignoring warning shots. One of the patients lifted a heavy metal armchair and, with a massive surge of strength, hurled it directly into the panoramic glass. The window detonated into billions of crystalline fragments, and a savage, freezing night wind rushed into the facility. Dr. Brandt burst into the lounge at the exact moment the 10 individuals lined up in an orderly queue at the precipice of the missing window, 10 stories above the concrete below. "Stop!" Brandt screamed, suffocating with panic. "What are you doing? That is death. You will fall." The group leader turned back to face him, his eyes reflecting the cold light of distant night stars. He took a deliberate step backward, out into the empty air, and before gravity seized his frame, his final words carried through the howling wind. "We are not falling, Doctor. We are simply going to see what is out there in the dark. Join us. There is no fear here anymore." Following his lead, holding hands in a human chain, the remaining 9 patients stepped calmly, one by one, into the empty air. When Brandt rushed to the shattered window and forced his gaze downward, the bodies lay scattered on the asphalt below. But there was no visual chaos, nor any signs of panic. Even after a descent from such an immense height, the features of every single individual retained that exact same flawless, blissful, serene smile of travelers who had finally discovered their home.